On the afternoon of February 26, 2025, a maintenance worker walked up to a house on a quiet, gated mountainside property outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, to perform a routine task he had done dozens of times before. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. He hadn't heard from the homeowners in roughly 2 weeks, which was longer than normal, but not yet alarming. He had grown concerned enough to bring a security guard along with him. When the two men reached the house, they did not get an answer at the door. So they looked through the windows. What they saw stopped them where they stood. They called the police immediately. Inside that house were the bodies of Gene Hackman, the 95-year-old, two-time Academy Award-winning actor behind some of the most celebrated performances in American film history, and his wife, the classical pianist Betsy Arakawa, 65 years old. One of their 3 dogs was also found dead, inside a closed crate in a nearby closet. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of violence, no immediate explanation for what had happened, or for how long the two of them had been lying there before anyone noticed. What followed was one of the most carefully reconstructed death investigations in recent memory. Not because investigators suspected a crime, but because the truth turned out to be stranger, sadder, and more medically specific than almost anyone watching from the outside expected. It involved a pacemaker. It involved a disease most Americans have never heard of, transmitted by something most people would never think to be afraid of. And it involved a question that the New Mexico Medical Examiner's office would eventually have to answer publicly. In a press conference that officials themselves described as virtually unprecedented, did Gene Hackman know, during what appeared to have been the final days of his own life, that his wife was already gone? This is what actually happened inside that house. Not rumor, not speculation. What the physical evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and the investigators who spent weeks piecing together a timeline from cell phone records, pacemaker data, and forensic pathology actually concluded. To understand how investigators were able to reconstruct what happened with this level of precision, you have to start with the condition in which the bodies were found, because it is what triggered the entire forensic timeline that followed. When the responding officers entered the home, they found Hackman near the kitchen entryway, with his cane and a pair of sunglasses on the floor beside him. Arakawa was found in a bathroom, with prescription pill bottles scattered near her body. Both bodies showed signs of partial mummification, a natural preservation process that occurs in dry, low-humidity environments, and one that immediately told investigators something critical. This was not a death that had happened the day before, or even a few days before. The level of decomposition and mummification present in both bodies indicated they had been there for an extended period, ultimately determined to be a span of multiple weeks. That single observation reframed the entire case. Investigators were not responding to a sudden, recent death. They were responding to the end point of something that had been unfolding, slowly and invisibly, inside that house for far longer than anyone outside it had any way of knowing. The first concrete piece of the timeline came from the most mundane source imaginable, Betsy Arakawa's last known activities in the days before she stopped responding to anyone. Investigators traced her movements using phone records, email correspondence, and witness accounts from people who interacted with her in her final days. On the morning of February 11th, she exchanged a short email with her massage therapist. Later that day, she drove into Santa Fe and ran a series of errands, stopping at a farmer's market, a CVS pharmacy, and a pet food store, before returning to the gated community where she and Hackman lived, passing through the entry gate at 5:15 in the afternoon. According to the sheriff's office, this is the last confirmed sighting of Betsy Arakawa alive. The following morning, February 12th, phone records show she placed a call to a concierge medical service in Santa Fe called Cloudberry Health. She was not an established patient there. According to the practice's founder, Arakawa described feeling congested and asked specifically about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a treatment involving breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized chamber, sometimes used to address respiratory symptoms. The clinic told her she should come in to discuss it further and scheduled her for an appointment that same day at 1:15 in the afternoon. Arakawa never showed up. When the clinic called to follow up, she did not answer. That missed appointment, investigators would later determine, marks the approximate point at which her condition began to deteriorate rapidly. What Arakawa did not know, what nobody in her life had any reason to suspect, because the disease she was dealing with does not announce itself in any way that would point toward its actual cause, was that she was in the early stages of a rare and frequently fatal respiratory illness called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. Hantavirus is not something transmitted between people. It originates almost exclusively from exposure to the droppings, urine, or saliva of infected rodents, most commonly deer mice, and it spreads to humans when contaminated dust containing the virus becomes airborne and is inhaled, something that can happen simply by sweeping out a shed, moving stored boxes, or disturbing an area where rodents have nested, without the person involved ever seeing or touching an animal directly. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, between 1993 and 2022, New Mexico recorded a total of 122 confirmed hantavirus cases and 52 deaths from the illness, making it a genuinely rare disease, but one with a fatality rate, once it progresses to its most severe form, that is alarmingly high. The chief medical examiner for the state of New Mexico, Dr. Heather Jarrell, explained during a subsequent press conference exactly how the illness typically progresses, and why it is so easy for someone to mistake its early symptoms for something far less serious. Patients usually feel generally unwell for somewhere between 3 and 6 days, experiencing symptoms that closely resemble a common flu: fatigue, fever, muscle aches, mild respiratory congestion. It is precisely the kind of presentation that would lead someone to describe themselves, as Arakawa reportedly did to the clinic that called her back, as merely congested and not seriously ill. But the illness can then transition, often abruptly, into what is known as the pulmonary phase, in which fluid begins rapidly accumulating in and around the lungs. At that stage, according to Dr. Jarrell, a person can die very quickly, within 24 to 48 hours, without immediate and aggressive medical treatment. Arakawa had no idea what she was actually fighting. By the time her symptoms would have become severe enough to make the danger unmistakable, she may have already been too compromised to call for the kind of help that could have saved her life. Investigators determined that February 12th, the day of her missed appointment, is the most likely date of her death. This is where the second, and in many ways more difficult, part of the investigation begins, because if Betsy Arakawa died on or around February 12th, that left a question that investigators had no easy way to answer using her side of the timeline alone. What happened to Gene Hackman during the days that followed? The answer came from an unlikely but remarkably precise piece of forensic evidence: Hackman's own cardiac pacemaker. Modern pacemakers continuously log the heart's electrical activity, creating a detailed internal record that can, in cases like this, function almost like a forensic timestamp. When investigators retrieved and analyzed the data from Hackman's device, it showed a final recorded instance of cardiac activity on February 18th, at which point the device recorded that he had been experiencing atrial fibrillation, an irregular and often distressing heart rhythm, in the hours before the recording stopped entirely. Investigators determined this was, in the words of Santa Fe County Sheriff Adon Mendoza, a very good assumption that it represented the actual day of his death. That places Gene Hackman's death roughly 6 days after his wife's, which means that for nearly a week, inside that house, on a property secluded enough that no one checked in, Gene Hackman was alone with his wife's body, and he was the only living person who could possibly have known what had happened to her. This is the question that the medical examiner's office was directly asked during their press conference, and it is the question that drew the most attention once their findings were made public. Did Hackman know his wife was dead? Was he aware, during those final days of his own life, of what had happened in his own home? Dr. Jarrell's answer was as honest and as carefully qualified as the evidence allowed it to be. Hackman, the autopsy confirmed, was in an advanced state of Alzheimer's disease at the time of his death. A post-mortem CT scan additionally revealing severe underlying heart disease and chronic high blood pressure, conditions that, combined with his cognitive state, painted a picture of a man in what Dr. Jarrell described as a very poor state of health overall. Given the severity of his Alzheimer's, she said, it's quite possible that he was not aware that she was deceased. It is, in its own way, one of the most quietly devastating conclusions to emerge from any recent forensic investigation involving a public figure. Not a crime. Not a conspiracy. A man in the final stages of a disease that had already taken much of his ability to understand and process what was happening around him, living out what were apparently the last days of his own life inside a house where his wife of more than 3 decades had already died, with no clear evidence that he ever fully comprehended it. The medical examiner noted that Hackman's body, when examined, showed signs of dehydration and an empty stomach, consistent with a man who, in his condition, was likely no longer capable of independently managing basic daily needs once the person who had been caring for him was gone. Investigators also worked quickly to rule out other potential explanations, both because thoroughness demanded it and because public attention on the case. Once news broke, became intense almost immediately. Initial toxicology testing for carbon monoxide came back negative for both Hackman and Arakawa. A subsequent inspection by the New Mexico Gas Company did identify a minor leak in one of the home's stove burners, but determined conclusively that it was far too small to have produced lethal carbon monoxide levels, and found no further gas line issues anywhere on the property. The home was also found to have several unrelated code violations, none of which investigators connected to the deaths. The full picture only became clear after a follow-up environmental assessment was conducted on the property, roughly a week after the bodies were discovered. Investigators from the New Mexico Department of Public Health surveyed all of the structures on the $4 million estate, not just the main residence, but 8 separate detached outbuildings scattered across the property. including small guest structures, sheds, garages, and parked vehicles. What they found explained with unsettling clarity exactly how Arakawa could have been exposed to a virus she had no reason to suspect was anywhere near her. Rodent droppings and nesting material were discovered across multiple outbuildings, in 2 small auxiliary homes, 3 separate sheds, 3 garages, and even inside 2 of the vehicles parked on the property. Critically, investigators found no significant signs of rodent activity inside the primary residence itself, which is consistent with exposure having occurred incidentally, likely during ordinary movement between the main house and the surrounding structures, rather than through any obvious visible infestation that the couple would have had reason to notice or address. The full timeline that investigators ultimately released to the public, after weeks of forensic work spanning pathology, cardiology, environmental health, and digital forensics, reads less like the plot of a thriller and more like a quiet, devastating account of how illness, isolation, and cognitive decline can converge in ways that go completely undetected by the outside world until it is far too late. Betsy Arakawa, a professionally accomplished classical pianist who had largely stepped back from public life to care for her husband as his health declined, contracted a rare viral illness from an exposure so minor and so ordinary that she had no way of recognizing the danger, sought medical guidance only once, missed the one appointment that might have led to a diagnosis, and died within roughly 24 to 48 hours of her condition turning critical. Alone in her own home with her husband present, but due to the advanced state of his own illness, almost certainly unable to understand what was happening or summon help. Gene Hackman, a man whose decades-long career had made him one of the most recognizable actors of his generation, then lived out what were apparently the final days of his own life in that same house, on his heart's own electrical activity quietly logging the final hours of a man whose mind, by that point, may no longer have been able to register the full weight of what had happened around him. This is also why investigators initially treated the case with such caution before releasing any details. The decision to make preliminary findings public at all was, in Dr. Gerald's own words, unprecedented for the Office of the Medical Investigator, a department that does not typically comment publicly on the specifics of an active death investigation, but the level of public interest in the case and the speed at which speculation, false rumors, and increasingly elaborate theories began spreading across social media in the days following the discovery of the bodies led officials to conclude that the circumstances genuinely required accurate, timely information to be shared directly with the public, rather than allowing a vacuum of confirmed facts to be filled indefinitely by guesswork. That vacuum, in the weeks that followed, was filled anyway, not with careful reporting, but with an entirely fabricated claim that spread rapidly across social media platforms, alleging that FBI agents had discovered a hidden tunnel system beneath the property, supposedly containing the remains of more than 700 bodies. The claim originated from a single online video published by a channel whose own description explicitly states that its content is for entertainment purposes only and may not be factually accurate. No law enforcement agency ever issued any statement remotely resembling this claim. No credible news organization ever reported it. It does not appear anywhere in the medical examiner's findings, the sheriff's office press conferences, or any of the search warrant documentation associated with the case. Documentation that, notably, was unsealed and made publicly available after a New Mexico judge ruled in favor of releasing investigative records, with the specific condition that any images of the couple's remains be obscured out of respect for the family. The fabricated tunnel story is not a hidden truth that slipped past investigators. It is a story that was invented for engagement, attached to a real tragedy, and believed by a significant number of people, specifically because the real explanation for illness, isolation, and the slow erosion of a man's ability to understand his own life felt to some too quiet and too sad to be satisfying on its own. But the quiet, sad version is what actually happened. It is documented in pacemaker logs, in postmortem CT scans, in a public health survey of rodent activity across 8 outbuildings, in cell phone records showing a missed medical appointment that might have changed everything, and in the careful, reluctant public statements of a medical examiner who clearly understood the human weight of what she was being asked to confirm. Gene Hackman died of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, with advanced Alzheimer's disease listed as a significant contributory factor. A man whose body, weakened by chronic hypertension and severe underlying heart disease, simply could not continue in circumstances that had become, in every practical sense, unsurvivable for someone in his condition. Betsy Arakawa died of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a disease so rare that most people, including likely Arakawa herself, would never have had reason to suspect it as the explanation for a few days of feeling generally unwell. What the investigation ultimately reconstructed was not a mystery in the conventional sense. It was a sequence of ordinary terrible misfortune. A woman who happened to disturb the wrong dust in the wrong outbuilding on her own property, A missed phone call back from a clinic that might have caught the illness in time, and a husband whose own mind ravaged by a disease with no cure. I may have spared him the full understanding of what he was living through in his final days, even as it left him completely unable to do anything about it. There was no tunnel. There were no hidden chambers, no conspiracy, no sinister secret waiting to be uncovered by federal agents. There was a 95-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's and severe heart disease, and a 65-year-old woman who had spent years quietly caring for him. Both of them isolated enough on a private mountainside property that an illness could take one of them, and a heart could finally give out on the other without anyone outside that house knowing anything was wrong for the better part of 2 weeks. That is the actual story. It required no embellishment to be devastating. It only required someone to ask the right questions, pull the right records, and have the patience to let the evidence speak for itself rather than reaching for something more sensational. Subscribe. Because the real story, more often than not, turns out to be the one worth telling honestly.